While the Range Rover Evoque represents the entry level into the Range Rover lineup, there is nothing entry level about this. Because with prices rising to just under 600,000 ringgit, this is a very expensive car. However, I will contend that this is actually a bargain basement Range Rover. And in this review, you'll find out why. My name is Aiman Abdullah. This is Malaysian Motoring. This is our review of the Range Rover Evoque Dynamic HSE. Now, arguably, compared to all other Range Rover models, the Evoque is potentially the most style-forward model. So much so that when the first generation Evoque came out, it brought about so many design changes that it was then bled through into the rest of the Range Rover lineup, and the same can be said here. Now, these full LED headlights come with an updated LED daytime running light signature where you no longer get the smaller rectangle here. Instead, it's just two LED strips, one slightly thicker than the other to give it the same overall signature. The grille has also been updated, which now has these sort of squircles in the middle to help emphasize the width. You also get a slightly updated front bumper with the LED fog lights sitting down there with a very Vela-like side strip here, which again helps to emphasize the width of the new Evoque. Now, one thing that I do appreciate about the Evoque is that it seems that this latest generation is more reductive, more minimalist than before, reducing all of the little design flourishes into what can only be described as quintessentially Evoque. Nothing more, nothing less. Instantly recognizable. And that same reduction can be applied to the side because now there are just so few lines on the side of the Evoque that it just looks more cohesive. Now, because this car maintains certain very Evoque design traits, you still get the massively flared wheel arches, as well as this cut line, which follows the arch of that wheel arch, again, to emphasize the width of this car. You still get these sort of little fender design elements here, although obviously they serve no function. And because this car comes replete with something called, or similar to a black pack, every detail on this car is done up in black, including the wing mirror surrounds, those little vents there, as well as the window surrounds themselves. And overall, it does make this car look quite good. Now, because this is the Dynamic HSE, it comes as standard with 21-inch alloy wheels wrapped in Pirelli Scorpion Zero tires with a new design for this update. Now, the Dynamic SE and Dynamic HSE all get different alloy wheel designs, and they all grow the further up in the lineup that you get. But of course, this being the most expensive Dynamic HSE models, you get the most expensive wheels. Now, all Evoques come as standard with these pop-out door handles. Now, it is worth noting that in addition to them being poppy-outy with a button here, the Range Rover Evoque has the best lock and unlock functionality that I've seen in any luxury car so far. Because as you walk up to the car, the door handles deploy, and as you walk away, they go back in and the car locks. This is by far the most reliable system I've seen so far, and of course it builds upon the walk-away lock that we've seen in lots of other cars, including Mazda's. And of course, when you lock it, or when the car is on the move, it sits nice and flush, reducing the number of areas on the side to disturb the wind as it goes past. Now, the back end of the Range Rover Evoque also sees a lot of very small changes. So for starters, the LED taillights now get a single U signature rather than the twin U signature that you used to get before. And of course, the rear bumper has been redone ever so slightly. Now, because, as I mentioned earlier, this car comes with that sort of blackout package, it means that the model designation here is done up in black, which is fine, particularly against this Corinthian gold metallic. The trouble that I have with it is that it also makes the brand designation come out in black, which against this black piece of bodywork just makes it disappear. Now, what's also disappeared obviously is the rear wiper, which is always sitting up here, which I think makes it look quite neat. But behind the tailgate, you will find a pretty decent amount of space. Now, the Range Rover Evoque is not a particularly large car, but that said, compared to other competitors within this space, such as the Porsche Macan, the Mercedes-Benz GLC, and so on, the space back here is still pretty good. This parcel shelf can actually hide underneath the boot floor, although honestly, why would you ever remove it? But of course, down here, you will find a space-saver spare wheel as well as some tools, because Land Rover customers, even if it's a Range Rover, should be able to do that. There are little hooks here for you to hang stuff up. There's a little net there for smaller items, as well as a 12-volt socket and this little ratchet strap here should you want to hold a bottle in place, for example, like a spare engine oil. Land Rover customers will get this. And of course, if you need more space, you can fold the rear seats 40-20-40 for added practicality. So overall, even though this is a small car, it does have a good amount of practicality in it, which is what you'd expect from a compact luxury SUV. But I think it's the inside of this facelifted Evoque where you see the biggest change of all. Because while you get an updated center Pivi Pro screen, which now has better graphics on this lovely curved display, which is not only responsive but also excellent to use, and it frankly looks absolutely sensational. But because this screen has been upgraded, the lower controls for your HVAC system is now gone. In its place, you will find a single USB-C port as well as a wireless phone charger, and back here you'll find a couple of cup holders. All of the controls for the terrain response system are also now in the screen, so you just have a piece of plastic here as well as this stubby little gear lever. Now, aside from that, everything in here does look very similar. There is an updated steering wheel now, unfortunately with the same touch controls that I've moaned about in other Land Rover products in the past, but at least it comes with this lovely dark chrome metallic surround, which I think looks quite good. And obviously, being a Range Rover, material quality in here is fantastic. Soft touch everywhere, this lovely leather here, and of course, the dynamic HSE, you also get Windsor leather upholstery for the seats, which are lovely and soft. Even here, everything is nice and pliant, and it's only when you get down to the further reaches down here, does the plastic get a little bit harsher. Now, these are not the only screens available here. You have one here, you have one here, which obviously is as customizable as we've seen before from other Land Rover products, but there is also another screen here. Because with many modern cars, the sight out of the rearview mirror can be quite shocking on the basis that the D-pillars are usually very thick in order to improve rollover protection, but as a result it means that again you can't really see much out of the back. Now, Land Rover has fixed this by fitting a camera to the roof of this vehicle, which then displays a feed onto this central screen. Now, this screen is not only incredibly adaptable, it never glares you, and it remains incredibly clear no matter what situation you find yourself in. Day, night, thunderstorm, whatever. It is beautifully clear, beautifully crisp, and of course, this is a very high refresh rate screen, so this is honestly better than a mirror. That said, however, the mirrors out the sides are a bit small. If you ask me, I prefer them to be a bit bigger because you can lose quite a bit in your blind spot, although mercifully there is obviously a blind spot monitoring system. Now, back to the practical aspects of this car, you get paddle shifters back here, which are done up in metal, nice and solid, and of course this is electrically adjustable. These seats obviously have memory functionality, although there is no heat or ventilation through the seats themselves. You get a lovely Meridian audio system in this car, which sounds fantastic. You've got cup holders here, bottle holders down there, a decently sized glove box here, and a decently sized center armrest box in here as well, where you will also find more USB ports should you need it. And of course, you also get the standard fit panoramic sunroof, which is so tinted, it genuinely makes no difference whether the sunshade is open or not. Now, in the back of the Evoque, you still get a few more niceties. So for example, the material quality back here still seems pretty good. You still get the same radio audio system with its myriad of speakers. And in terms of space, with this seat setup in my driving position, I do have a decent amount of kneeroom and a decent amount of headroom again, despite that panoramic sunroof. And because the floor is actually tilted upwards, it does mean that I have a pretty good place to rest my feet and then enjoy decent under-thigh support. You get a couple of aircon vents back here, but only in the center, not through the B-pillar. You get a couple of USB-C ports as well as a 12-volt socket in the middle. You get a deployable center armrest with a couple of cup holders, and overall everything back here does seem pretty well fit. You get a couple of ISOFIX mounts, both on the outer seats, although that said, these doors do not open as wide as you might necessarily want in order to fill a bulky rear-facing child seat, although once they're in, because the front seats are not that thick, you should have a decent amount of space. Now, if you ask me, the Evoque is perhaps the best demonstration of how Land Rover is very good at designing cars that have a lot of presence on the road by looking very big and very stately, and then not translating it to that much room in here. Every time I get into the back of an Evoque, I am reminded that this is not actually that big of a car. I keep thinking that this is 1 or 2 segments larger, when in reality, this is a compact luxury SUV. That said, however, from behind the wheel, it is a very different story. Now for the latest Range Rover Evoque, you can either get this as a P200 or a P250. The P200 offers 200 PS and some Newton meters of torque, but we have the P250, which offers 250 PS and more torque. Now power goes to all four wheels via an 8-speed automatic gearbox and Land Rover's usual proprietary terrain response system. Now what that means is there isn't really that much of a change over the outgoing Evoque, where it's still a mostly petrol-powered lineup. You can't get a diesel anymore. The previous generation was available with a diesel, but apparently our diesel isn't good enough for Land Rover diesel engines, so we don't get those anymore in Malaysia, which is fine because they represented a tiny proportion of buyers anyway. Now the reason why I appreciate the Evoque is because behind the wheel, it really does feel like a Range Rover. Now, having driven the full-fat Range Rover as well as the Range Rover Velar and hopefully soon the Range Rover Sport, there is a certain way these cars drive, the way they isolate the driver from everything going on around them. So for example, if you were to get into a Porsche Macan, it is very much about the driving experience, about that sensation that you are part of the car, the vehicle is an extension of you. Whereas in a Range Rover, it's more about being isolated. So for starters, the driving position in the Evoque is very different from what you get from other SUVs. In this car, you sit very much on it rather than in it, and as a result, you have a very commanding view all the way around, of course aided by the wing mirrors I mentioned earlier, and of course that clear view monitor that shows me what's going on out the back. And it does invite you to sit a little bit more upright than you would in any other SUV, where you would be appreciative of a more car-like sort of seating position. This is very much like an old school SUV. And like an old school SUV, the emphasis in this car is very clearly on comfort. These seats, for example, are so lovely and soft, while still offering a good amount of support. You have a good amount of lumbar, and you also have adjustable side bolster support to keep you nice in place, so it feels very cozy in here. The steering wheel, for example, is not artificially small. In fact, compared to other vehicles within this range, this is actually a very large steering wheel, which again makes it feel more like the full-fat Range Rover. So getting into the Evoque, it does feel like you have the Range Rover experience condensed into a smaller package. And the same can be said of this particular powertrain, because there is certainly more than enough power and torque to get this car going, and so it does feel like a very luxurious experience. And of course, the benefit of this turbocharged 4-cylinder is that when you put your foot down, it's actually quite a pleasant noise. And when you stomp on the anchors, the car will stop. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Range Rover is geared towards comfort, which means the ride in here is also absolutely sublime. This car's primary ride irons out the very worst lumps and bumps that the world can throw at it, and it does so in a manner without ever really interrupting or bothering the cabin. Passengers and drivers will be able to appreciate this car's softer setup in the sense that it makes the car feel, again, very isolating on the road. So you can cover lots and lots of motorway miles without too much problems, and of course you can also cover urban ground without feeling too flustered. It is unfortunate, however, that these seats do not come with a massage function or indeed ventilation. Ventilation especially is very useful when you're driving about in town as we go about this heat wave. But when you're out on the open road, usually a softer setup does result in a car that's a bit more wishy-washy, a bit more roly-poly and so on, and therefore slightly less confident when you're driving at speed. But in the Evoque, that is certainly not the case. This car has adaptive shocks, which means that the car will adjust itself and its rebound rate as it sees fit in order to provide the best possible experience behind the wheel, and that is most notable when you're on the motorway, because the car does firm up in a very natural fashion in order to help control the body as you go through changes and large curves and so on. What that means is this cabin remains unflustered no matter what. Even when you're driving north of the speed limit, the amount of noise that gets in here is very, very well muted. Wind noise is very well suppressed, road noise is very well suppressed, no doubt from the kilograms upon kilograms of sound deadening material that are in this car. And again, it just makes this a very, very upmarket place to be. Miles better than what you get from an equivalent BMW or Mercedes-Benz. What a Range Rover doesn't do very well is dynamics, save for the Range Rover Sport, which I haven't driven yet. But this Evoque is not about corner carving of any sort or measure. This is a car that's geared towards comfort. And so when you try to attack a back road intently, you will find that the Range Rover Sport will struggle somewhat. Firstly, the throttle response in this car is quite dulled. And when you pair it to this gearbox that is geared towards smooth changes, it does mean that, again, those responses are not as sharp as you'd want them to be for a dynamic drive. No matter what you do to the driving mode, should you go into dynamic I or whatever, that doesn't really change. So it's quite clear that the hardware in this car is made for smooth, progressive motion rather than intense, enthusiastic driving. Which is fine, because if you wanted enthusiastic driving, you'd buy a Jag. Now, what I'd advise when driving an Evoque is ultimately when you see a corner, slow down, get through it in a dignified fashion, and then power yourself back out again. Because trying to maintain speeds through corners in this just feels a little bit undignified. It's not that the car can't do it. There's plenty of mechanical grip, and those Pirelli Scorpion Zero tires do an excellent job at keeping this car's weight in check, even when you're chucking it around like a hooligan. But again, this is a Range Rover, which means it's meant to be driven with a certain degree of dignity, a certain air to it. And so don't drive it like a hooligan, because that's just uncouth. Instead, if you drive it like a civilized human being, this is a very civilized car. It's quiet, it's comfortable, the Meridian audio system is fantastic, and of course you have a heads-up display which gives you all of the directions and relevant information that you need, which means you never need to take your eyes off the road anyway, except for when you're trying to use the infernal steering wheel controls, which you have to if you want to use this car's ADAS system. So as standard across the lineup, you get a full suite of active safety features, which include things like autonomous emergency braking, blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, traffic jam assist, etc., etc. And of course, manipulating those requires you to use the infernal touch buttons on the steering wheel. Now, there are some ridges sort of between the buttons, so you can broadly figure out where your fingers are going, but honestly, I would have just preferred actual physical buttons, because there is nothing better than an actual physical button. On top of that, these buttons do not feel nearly as high quality as these metal shift pedals, and it just feels like this could have been executed just a little bit better. On top of that, when you do use the system, it reveals this car's other slight shortfall. Because when you're driving it over a longer distance, say on a motorway or something like that, where you're adjusting speed based on cars slowing down ahead of you, it's really not that bad. It's quite intelligent about how it goes about its business, and it can be quite smooth. The trouble arises when you're trying to use the system in town, because unfortunately, it is just not as smooth as you'd want it to work and to react. So while using the traffic jam assistant on this car, I have found that the Evoque likes to hit the brakes rather late and then rather hard at that to bring this hulking mass to a stop. And then once the vehicle in front does take off, it takes a little bit of time before then also taking off, which again, it compensates by hitting the throttle a little bit harder, and then the car in front slows down, then you hit the brakes, and then you just end up sort of looking like a moron through a traffic jam. So I've been doing it myself most of the time in order to maintain that air of dignity that comes with a Range Rover. But that aside, everything in here does work quite well. I would have preferred the all controls for the HVAC system and the terrain response system, simply because having that screen and dial mix in the center was just a lovely tactile experience in order to adjust the necessary functionalities. And I do feel that it works in a very upmarket way, something that is very much in keeping with the Range Rover brand. By putting everything in the central screen, while the screen is very good and everything responds quite well, it's just not as upmarket or as polished as I would have come to expect from a Range Rover. But apparently this is just the way the world is going to work now. Everything's going to go into a screen, everything's going to be touch sensitive because it's easier or cheaper or whatever the hell else it might be. And so if you ask me, it's just one of those things we have to get used to. I do appreciate the fact that the voice assistant in this car is smart enough for it to be able to adjust lots of settings that you need it to adjust. Things like the air conditioning controls, for example, you can just control via voice. But the terrain response system does again require more inputs within that screen, which is less than ideal. But what's very clear is that the Range Rover Evoque is very much a Range Rover, which means that it operates in a way that is so much more polished and so much better executed than lots of other brands. While, for example, a Porsche is an excellent example of German engineering quality, the Range Rover Evoque is just a very different animal. There is something about the way this car works throughout the week I've had with this, the way it delivers its power, the way it sounds, the way the PV Pro system works, it's just such a polished experience that I can somewhat justify that very, very high asking price. 560,000 ringgit for this range-topping dynamic HSE is not affordable no matter how you slice it, especially considering the fact that the Mercedes-Benz GLC and BMW X3 are all much more affordable vehicles. However, that polish that you get in this car is truly unmatched. And so if you were to test drive these cars back to back, you will then be able to understand what it is that I'm talking about. The way the Range Rover goes about its business justifies that $500,000 price tag, as unbelievable as that might sound. And that, to me, is what makes the Evoque a Range Rover. A lot of people did ask when this car first came out if it's just a dressed up Land Rover Freelander, which at the time it certainly was. The thing is, there is no more Freelander. We now only have the Discovery Sport, which is another car that I've also driven and certainly presents itself very differently from the Range Rover Evoque itself. So to me, there is a reason why this car is positioned and priced the way it is, simply because it is a Range Rover. However, if you want a vehicle within this segment that is perhaps more driver focused, then you may be better served by a Porsche Macan. There is also an electric Macan coming should you want a similar package and a similar sort of product with all electric motivation. And of course, if you want something that is more affordable, you should probably look at a BMW or a Mercedes-Benz, because the competitors to this car are locally assembled, which means that the entry price is obviously a little bit more easy to swallow. But if you want the very best in this segment, then arguably this is it, because this segment is defined by size and luxury. And this car has the size down pat, and it's certainly very luxurious indeed. Exceedingly so, in a very Range Rover sort of way. In any case, that's been our review of the Range Rover Evoque Dynamic HSE P250. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon so you're notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All the links are in the description below. You can join our new WhatsApp channel. That link is down there too. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.